Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. World Wide Web means the whole world, and we welcome everyone in the world to this broadcast this evening, where we will be celebrating and conversing about Charles Wright's Black Zodiac. I'm Patrick here, representing Chapter 16, with a few introductory remarks that will be very brief before we bring out our very special guests. This conversation is part of the 50 Years, 50 Books series at chapter16.org, exploring 50 significant books published in Tennessee in the last 50 years. This program is presented by Humanities Tennessee as part of its 50th anniversary year. When you're done watching this, please, if you're looking to click around, visit chapter16.org for the full list of these books and additional features. All right, here we go. We're going to be meeting our guests for the evening. Jesse Graves is the author of 4 poetry collections, including Tennessee Landscape with Blighted Pine and a book of prose, songs, essays on poetry and place. He has edited several volumes of poetry and scholarship, including the forthcoming The Complete Poetry of James Agee from University of Tennessee Press. Jesse's work has received the James Still Award for writing about the Appalachian South from the Fellowship of Southern Writers. He teaches at East Tennessee State University. Erica Wright is the author of 7 books, including the essay collection Snake and the poetry collection All the Bayou Stories End with Drowned. She is a former editorial board member of Alice James Books and currently teaches at Bellevue University. She holds degrees from New York University and Columbia University. Her latest mystery novel, Hollow Bones, inspired by Shakespeare's Measure for Measure, will be released in August. She lives in Knoxville, Tennessee, with her family, where she is trying, so far unsuccessfully, to befriend the local crows. Okay, everyone out there in internet land, put your hands together for Jesse and Erica. Take it away.
Hi there. Welcome, everyone.
Well, hi, Erica.
Jesse.
Erica, it's nice to meet you finally. I've been reading your reviews for such a long time.
Nice to meet you as well, especially since you're just down the road. You're just about an hour from here.
We're practically neighbors, and I've spent a lot of formative years in Knoxville, so I know and love that place well.
It's a great city, and yep. Charles Wright lived here for part of his life, so that's a nice tie-in.
Well, Erica, the first thing I wanted us to talk about is how you came to choose his poetry collection, Black Zodiac, for this special series of 50 Tennessee books for 50 years.
Well, it's such a cool series, and I was really delighted to be asked. And Maria Browning, the editor of Chapter 16, sent me a list of possibilities, and Charles Wright jumped out at me immediately. I've been a fan of his poetry since for 2 decades now. And I'd read Black Zodiac, but it was not my kind of touchstone Charles Wright book. For me, that's Buffalo Yoga. So I love the idea of let's revisit it. And, I'm already a fan of his work, but what was so special about this collection that, it went on to win the Pulitzer Prize, it went on to win the National Book Circle Critics Award, the Los Angeles Book Prize. So I really was excited to take a look at this book and just dive deep into it. I had this idea that I would kind of do a very intellectual review of the book, but then I found when I was reading it that I just actually had a very emotional response to these poems, which I did not have in my early 20s. I think Charles Wright was in his late 50s when he was writing Black Zodiac. I'm in my mid 40s, so not exactly the same, but we're still in that big middle-aged group. And I was really just kind of very emotional with the ways he was expressing sort of anxiety of aging, people in your past that are gone, there's that kind of, I think of it as that famous passage about his mother never being able to meet his bearded grandson. And for some reason that it almost just like grabbed my heart when I was reading this. So I ended up writing kind of a less intellectual and more kind of emotionally relevant, I hope, response. What about you? What's your history with this book?
Yeah. Oh, I love this book so much. Although it's not probably my touchstone Charles Wright book either. That would be an earlier book of his called The Southern Cross, which remains my favorite probably. It's been collected in The World of the 10,000 Things, kind of his middle trilogy of books. And I love those ones so much.
Yeah, I think that's how I felt when I first discovered them. It just seemed, it was sort of, I think it just seemed like great lyric poetry and unapologetically lyric poetry. That there's this full embrace of the tradition. And in fact, when I was writing the review, I was looking through this kind of this came out quite a while ago. It's the Conversations interviews, collected interviews. And he talks about that. He's almost a little bit cheeky in the way he speaks about other traditions, because he says, you can get other things from prose, but lyric poetry, this sort of mind on an ocean, I think he describes it as, you can't get that anywhere else. And he kind of fully leans in to that lyric poetry tradition, which is, it's exciting. It's exciting to read these sort of unapologetic poems. And speaking of humor, one thing I love about this book is that, he has these meditations on mortality, on death, how it's inevitable. And then he has these little moments where he says, but not yet, like not today, not today. And I would laugh every time. I love it. It's almost sort of like, not yet, death. You're not yet. I'm not ready for you yet.
I'll have to deal with you someday, but not today.
Not today. Yeah.
I love that you have that Conversations book, because
what's this one?
This is by the same author, Robert D. Denham, Bob Denham, who taught for years up at Roanoke College. So with my water glass, here's a cheers to Bob Denham, who I think is the most important Charles Wright scholar. They actually went to college together at Davidson College in North Carolina, and Denham just kept up with his work and kept up with him. And we were able to bring Charles Wright here to ETSU back in 2017. And, he was already getting up into his middle, I think he was 83 that year. And Bob Denham came down from Roanoke for it. It was so great to see a reunion of those two old friends, college friends even. And Denham's guide, it's called A Companion to the Late Poetry, that goes up through 2007. And there's a companion to the early poetry. And I just think Denham's done the best work that's been done on Charles Wright's work, on his poetry.
That's fantastic. I was thinking about our great poetry critics, because Helen Bindler died this week. And I was wondering, who's taking up her torch, who's going to carry that forward. And, there are writers. And I think hopefully with poetry's kind of rise in attention right now, hopefully those critics will also have an equal rise in attention.
Yeah, I feel you with that. I sent a picture of my Helen Bindler shelf to some friends this morning when I read her obituary. She was a big Charles Wright fan. She wrote a lot about his poetry, and was probably part of the lifting up of his work into that sort of top tier of American poets of his generation.
I saw her give a lecture on Wallace Stevens, and you mentioned the sort of Black Zodiac feels like Wallace Stevens, or at least in that same league. And I feel that as well, that One thing I like about lyric poetry in general is this idea of you can enter it, you could read the same poem every day of your life, and you're going to get something new out of it. And I feel like Charles Wright is writing at that sort of Wallace Stevens level, that these are, the references. I know even when I was reviewing this, that, I just had to kind of let go of the idea that I was going to get every reference. But if you have more time, you have a different day, you find another one, and you follow that wave of the ocean.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the way to approach this. Just read it straight through, even if you don't get every reference, even if you don't get every allusion. Just keep reading it, because the poetry has such a cadence to it, and it's such beautifully made poetry. Erica, you had suggested that we might read a passage or two, maybe just in case there's someone listening who isn't all that familiar with his work, and this is the book. How would it be if maybe I were to read just from a little section from the first poem in the book?
I think that's great. Yeah, absolutely.
This book has some longer poems in it, and this is one of them, the Apologia Pro Vita Sua. And I'll just read the first section and then maybe mention a couple lines from the third section of this poem that have really sort of stuck with me. But I think you see in this opening section a whole lot of what you were talking about in his work, with the weightiness and also the lightness that can counterbalance it. Apologia Pro Vita Sua. How soon we come to road's end. Failure, our two-dimensional sidekick, flat dreamlight, won't jumpstart or burn us in. Dogwood insidious in its constellations of part-charred crosspoints. Spring's Via Dolorosa, flashed out in a dread profusion. Nowhere to go but up, nowhere to turn. Dead world weight. They've gone and done it again. Dogwood, spring's sap-crippled arthritic, winter-weathered myth limb, whose roots are my mother's hair.
It's a way to start a book, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So much happening in that opening section that gives us introduces us to this idea of failure and how we're never far removed from it. It's our two-dimensional sidekick, as he calls it, which to me has a little, like, failure as your sidekick. It makes me kind of want to laugh and also cry a little bit at the same time. And then the roots that are my mother's hair, and we know that we're in this lyric poetry, as you were saying. The lyricism of that, the sort of metaphorical quality of that is so rich to me, because it's personal, and he is thinking about his literal mother, but he's also thinking about these trees, and he's thinking about nature, and he's thinking about the cycles that we're a part of.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, I feel like I just am drawn to that dead world weight. I think that's a very Charles Wright phrase. Not only the sort of Hopkins-esque hyphenated, the sort of, let's create something new out of existing language, but just that right there at the beginning, that these poems are going to be about the big themes, that these are not small poems. These are poems about life and death and nature and mortality and existence. And you're in for a ride.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Hey, we already have a question.
I know, I'm excited.
Yeah.
It says, I guess viewers can't see the questions, so we should read them aloud. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. Are there 1 to 2 poems specifically related to Tennessee that you recommend to introduce Charles Wright to readers? Excellent question. There is one that references Tennessee in this book, and let me find it for you. I think it's, actually, it is the first poem in the book, Apologia Pro Vita Sua, which is Latin for something like in defense of a life, which, by the way, is in itself a little bit funny. Like, I'm gonna have a poem like defending my life. But this references Tennessee specifically, and I think if you are from Tennessee or you're a fan of the state, you'll recognize the landscape. So Charles Wright lived all over. And I don't know that he spent the majority of his life in Tennessee. In fact, I suspect not. But you can see a lot of the sort of Appalachian landscape in this collection and in a lot of his work. Second poem, I'm blanking on that one, but I feel like if you want to get this book, the first poem, it's a very Tennessee poem, I think.
My favorite Tennessee poem by Charles Wright is actually not in Black Zodiac, and I'm kind of blanking on which book it's in, but it's roughly the same time period. So it must be in one of the books either before or after. This was an incredibly fecund period in his writing life. Like every couple of years, he was having great book after great book for really a couple decades, it seemed like. But my favorite Tennessee poem is called Arrivederci Kingsport.
That's good.
There's a little bit of that playfulness that we talked about. And also it is, Kingsport is where he spent so much of his childhood. He wasn't born there, but he was born in Pickwick Dam, Tennessee, which I think is sort of lower middle western part of Tennessee. I've actually never been there, which would be a nice pilgrimage to find Charles Wright's birthplace. He lived in Knoxville some, and then he lived a lot of his childhood and high school years in Kingsport. And so Arrivederci Kingsport brings in that sense of Kingsport in Tennessee as the home place, but the Italian world that opened up for him when he was in the army and stationed in Italy. And I think when you're reading his poems from the beginning, like in Oblivion Banjo, Italy is the first landscape that really sort of opens up seems to unlock something in him. And he writes so much about being in Italy. And so to have a later poem that includes both of those worlds, I thought was just a brilliant combination. Plus that they have such a musicality together. Arrivederci Kingsport.
It does. It fits perfectly together. Well, it's interesting because one thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit based on Black Zodiac, but also these conversations, was this idea that Charles Wright very much saw himself as a Southern poet. He was sort of proud of that title. Mm-hmm. But what I was surprised to learn in these conversations is that he didn't feel as if he was part of the Southern tradition. And he kind of emphasized that in several interviews. One, whom I will not name, pushed him on it, really wanted him to kind of commit to this. And he kept saying, no, I'm not part of this Southern tradition. That is a more kind of storytelling tradition. And I'm interested in the sort of musicality of poetry. Yeah. And I was startled by that. I was surprised because I do think of these as being very Southern poems. And I also think of music as being kind of part of Southern culture as well.
I think that's true. I feel like so many of the celebrated Southern writers are narrative writers, and even the poets are narrative poets. And I find myself drawn a lot to that. And as in my own poems and in the poets that I tend to gravitate toward, I love a good narrative poem. I think Charles Wright has sometimes a little bit of embedded narrative or a little bit of hidden narrative in his poems. You can kind of see an arc developing over the course of a longer poem, but he never really spends a lot of time with the stories the way that like James Dickey or even the late great Fred Chappell, who we just lost earlier this year, one of the greatest of all the Appalachian poets, passed away in January. And his narrative poems they can be hilarious, they can make you cry, but they always are telling these beautiful lyrical stories. And I think that's probably I think that's been overlooked maybe a little bit in Charles Wright's work. I feel like he has not been much recognized as a Southern or Appalachian writer, even though he really did embrace both. The book after Black Zodiac, the one that follows the Pulitzer Prize winner, was titled Appalachia. And in this book, there is a poem that I really love. I've been reading these all sort of in sequence. In this book, he publishes one called The Appalachian Book of the Dead. And then in Appalachia, the book that came out in 1999, he has 5 more of those Appalachian Book of the Dead poems that are like Appalachian Book of the Dead 2 and 3 and 4. And so he has this whole sequence of these, they aren't they aren't necessarily set in Appalachia, and they don't really look a lot like, what would be more traditional Appalachian type poetry, which is more narrative and place-based. But he really consciously sort of centers his work in the region and the place, and really came back to it has come back to it throughout his whole writing life.
And I feel like there's a real kind of push right now, a positive push to expand what we mean by Appalachian art and Appalachian literature. And I think Wright's part of that tradition, and he's this high intellectual, which I think we don't normally associate with Appalachian writers, although I think, of course, we should. And maybe even the ones that he sort of lists out when he's talking about, I'm not part of this tradition. I'm not John Crow Ransom. I'm not I'm not James Dickey. It's like, okay, yeah, but you are sort of still this towering figure.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that my old mentor Robert Morgan is, to me, kind of like the quintessential Appalachian poet, and yet there's no poetry that I know more intellectually rigorous or expansive than Robert Morgan's. I mean, I just think he's his mind is on this other plane, and there's science, there's mythology, there's literary allusion. It's a little bit more plain spoken than Charles Wright, I think. And so in that way, maybe it blends a little better with some of the Appalachian poets of a previous generation. But there's so many great ones. And I think expanding that canon of Appalachian writers and Southern writers even, but specifically Appalachian, I think has been a really valuable project for at least 10 or 15 years now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so exciting. We get to see these I want to say young writers, but sometimes it's not young writers. It's just ones that have not received the attention that they kind of very much deserved. Yeah. You had mentioned, we've never met before, as you all probably realize, but you had mentioned that this book, or Charles winning the Pulitzer Prize, was kind of important to you personally. Do you want to speak to that for a minute, Jesse, and then we'll answer this question?
Oh yeah, I will. Thank you. Yeah. I would be glad to. I was this book won the Pulitzer Prize the year that I went to graduate school. So I went off to upstate New York. I was at Cornell University there to study with Robert Morgan and the great A.R. Ammons, and I'd never lived outside of Tennessee. I'd never lived further. I grew up about an hour north of Knoxville, a little community called Sharps Chapel. And I lived in Knoxville to go to college, but I never lived anywhere else, and had never even been to New York at that time. And I was feeling very overwhelmed by the experience and by the intensity of this place and this kind of celebrated university. And I was there for an MFA, a Master of Fine Arts. And in my MFA class, there were 4 poets, one from Los Angeles, one from Seattle, one from New York City, and one from Sharps Chapel, Tennessee. I was like, I'm way out of my depth here. Yeah. And then Charles Wright wins the Pulitzer Prize, and I get into my first workshop, and we're going around the room, and the professor asks us who we're reading and what we love. And one of my classmates, who was a year ahead of me, I hadn't even met him yet, said, my favorite poet right now is a Southern poet named Charles Wright. And I was like, oh my God, I can't believe it. I thought I was going to say Charles Wright. I thought I might be the only person who'd ever read him by that time. But no, I mean, that his breakthrough in some ways made me feel, I don't know, validated as a Tennessee writer, as a Southern writer, as a writer from Appalachia, way up north, with a bunch of people from much more cosmopolitan lives and backgrounds than I'd had. And so this book has always been just so dear to me because of that. And his work, from then on and backwards, discovering the earlier work, just it was so great for a little country kid from East Tennessee to know that another, not quite as country kid, but another boy from East Tennessee had written some really good poetry.
It's funny you say that because I have a somewhat similar experience, which was during my first week of my MFA program in New York City. I've been living in New York for a while. I wasn't intimidated by the city. I was just intimidated about speaking in front of a class. It was never my strong sword. So in my mid-20s, now that I teach, I'm a little bit better. And as an icebreaker, we were asked to go around the room and name our trinity of contemporary living poets. And it was as if I had never read a book before in my life. My mind just went. And I'm about 6. I'm counting. I'm not listening to what anyone else is saying. I'm just scrambling to think of 3 living poets. And finally, when it got to be my turn, I said Charles Wright. And that's all I said. And the teacher very kindly said, just Charles Wright. And I think I mentioned 2 more. I might have said, I think, Zaborska. And at the time I was reading Frederick Seidel. But it was a real moment of panic. And Charles Wright was the first name out of my mouth. I don't even know. I feel like it was probably true that he probably was one of my sort of Trinity poets. But I would have said anyone. I would have said any name that came to mind. So he saved me too. He saved me too in that opening week, which is always stressful, I think.
So hard. I love Zaborska, by the way.
No one's comfortable. You think everyone else is, but everyone's nervous.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
We've got a great question over here. As writers, can you talk about the importance of observation and how you keep that ability sharp?
Yeah, that is a great question. You want to take the first turn on that one?
Sure. Well, there is this notion of, I've always thought there's something exciting about a young person who is attracted to poetry, because I do think that whenever you're young, your mind is more agile, that you're kind of going to, you're remembering more, you're absorbing, if you're taking classes, either formally or informally, your mind's just absorbing this information. It's a very exciting time. And I actually do worry that my ability is, lessening over time. So I don't know who asked this question, but you've kind of jumped right into one of my personal kind of writing anxieties. I think that what happens is your kind of interest shift, though, that, you are, whatever you're kind of obsessed with at one age is not necessarily going to be your same obsession. I never thought that I would be writing poems about, motherhood. And that's what I'm, writing now, because that's my sort of whole world with a 3-year-old. So you just have to kind of, whatever you are writing about, I think if you just turn that lens and just sort of intensity of focus, I think some kind of interesting things happen. And I don't know, I feel like I'm not answering this question as well as I would like to. Jesse, do you have any better insights?
Oh yeah, well, that was a great answer. And I feel like that is an anxiety, and you're right to think that, like, as we've done a lot of this, I mean, by this age, I've written hundreds, lots of poems, way more poems than really probably would share with anybody. But you do kind of have some anxiety that maybe I'm not noticing things. I'm not able to express with the same energy or intensity that maybe I once was. And I actually have a little bit of strategy for this. It's not a strategy per se, but I have something that I've found that helps me with it. I have this little group of poet friends, sort of 4 of us at the core for about 14 years now. And we occasionally have 1 or 2 other folks drop in with us, but about 3 times, sometimes 4 times a year, we will do one of those poem a day poetry marathons. And, we never do it during April because a bunch of us are on academic schedules, and you just can't. April's the worst time to try to do anything besides just be in teaching. And so I find that, like, February is great. July, October, these have been the best months for me. But the value of doing this is not that I'm writing a good poem every day or even most days, but that I'm writing every day. And that the first 3 or 4 days, I feel like I write the poems that I've sort of stockpiled, because we'll plan this a month or 2 in advance. And July 1st, I've got an idea. I've been thinking, something's been sort of clunking around in the back of my mind. And I'm ready to try to write that down. And sometimes those first 2 or 3 are really pretty good and pretty developed. And then, but then after about 5 days, you're like, whoa, wait, that's all I had. The stockpile is empty now. What am I going to do for 25 more days? And I can't tell you how many times the best poem that I've written out of a month has come on like the 28th, the 29th, like right at the end, because if you're going to do this and really do it, you kind of have to train yourself to notice more and to pay closer attention to like whatever happens outside the window, or whatever you hear somebody say to you, or whatever memory happens to pop back into your mind. Because if you don't, you just don't have anything to write on the 29th day out of 30 of writing. And to me, that has kept that sense of observation, that importance of observation, as the question mentions, that's kept it in tune a little bit for me. And some poets write every day, and I applaud them, and I'm amazed by them. Old William Stafford wrote a poem every day for years and years. And at a reading once, someone asked him, what do you do if you're just having an off day, or you just didn't have time what if it's just not good one day? And he's like, you lower your standards and you move on, right? Tomorrow's a new day. And that's really good advice for writers, I think. But Erica, let's stay on this question for a minute, because I know you're a fiction writer, and I'm really envious of that, because as my first poetry teacher, Connie Jordan Green, likes to remind me when I get to see her in Knoxville, she'll say, do you remember when you thought you were a fiction writer? And I'll say, on day one of poetry class, I probably said, I'm a fiction writer, really. I'm just here for, whatever. But I never have really written much fiction. And so I wonder if sort of offshoot of this question, or to extend this question a little, if your observation is different, or if you think about this differently when you're writing fiction and when you're writing poetry.
Well, I always say that writing prose feels like work, and I mean that in a positive way. That there's something about, you go to your desk, I handwrite all my drafts, but there's never a day when I can't write a few sentences. That I think that I can always write something. I can always move the story forward, especially if you lower your standards, which is excellent advice. And that's not the same is not true of poetry for me. I love this idea of a challenge, but I feel like there's this funny kind of quirk of poetry that every time you write a poem, you have to figure out how to do it again. And I hope this doesn't happen for surgeons or for, electricians, that I feel like they go to their job very confident that they can fix this problem. But every time, you sit down to write a poem, you think, how in the world is this done again? How do you get it rolling? How do you move from there? I think particularly with lyric poetry, right? Particularly when you're sort of following these threads and seeing where they lead, and there's a real trust to your subconscious that you have to kind of embrace. As opposed to, fiction, I can always kind of tinker with something, even if I'm figuring out a plot point, or I'm figuring out, character development. Dialogue's a real weakness of mine, so I'm trying to figure out the dialogue. I can't recall a single session where I didn't come away with at least a paragraph that either I would use, or it would kind of illuminate some sort of point. But poetry is a whole other, it's tricksy. Poetry's tricksy.
It's a new world every day for poets.
It's a new world every day. But I was thinking, I was thinking of someone else's advice on this point, which I would share, because I tell this anecdote a lot when I'm teaching poetry. I went to, I think it was Marie Pensot's 80th birthday celebration in New York City at the Unterberg Poetry Center. And one of her children was was talking about the way that she wrote when she was a single mom raising several children. And she would force herself to write one line of poetry every night. And she knew that she wouldn't necessarily have the energy or the time to write a poem, but she could write one line. And sometimes she would write one line and crash. But other times she would write one line, it would lead to two, and it would lead to three. And more than that. So I've always thought kind of night lines are a nice way to stay sharp as well. And whenever I don't do them every night as consistently as Marie Pensot, but when I do feel like I'm in a rut, that's kind of a technique I go to. And it's the same thing. It doesn't have to be great. It just has to be a line.
That's great. That's great advice, because there's always time for a line. There may not be time to develop a sonnet or or a full poem but there's always time for a line, even if it's just, even if you're thinking of it while you're brushing your teeth before bed. I'm kind of a night owl myself, and really always have been geared that way. And so I'm often doing my poem a day during those months, like at midnight, and that kind of works for me. When my daughter was little, I got on a morning schedule, and I could make that work too. But then I've sort of fallen back into my natural pattern. My parents were early birds, which made me a night owl because I couldn't get up earlier than them, but I could stay up later than them. And so that's when the house would be quiet and I could do, whatever I felt like I wouldn't do if my mom were awake. And it sort of stuck with me to the nighttime is like a headspace you can get into. And I know this doesn't work for everybody, but night lines is kind of a good way to phrase that. I like that phrase a lot.
Yeah, it stuck with me. I mean, that was more than a decade ago. And I just remember very clearly this idea of, it would seem as if her circumstances would make it impossible to write. And yet she still did. She still was, this part of her identity never disappeared. Even whenever, she did not have time for that dedicated time that we think of as important for poetry.
Yeah.
Another great question. Yeah.
These questions have been amazing.
They have been, yeah.
All right, can I read this one?
Please.
Can the terms Southern and Appalachian feel limiting as a writer, in the sense of what expectations there are based on those words? That's a great question. And just about every Southern and Appalachian writer I know has had to think about it.
I would say I do think that they could feel limiting, which is, I think, why I like how energetically Charles Wright embraces the term Southern poet, that he, it doesn't shy away from it at all, because it can feel as if you're kind of being boxed in a certain sense. I don't think it's limiting in terms of what you could write. I think it's maybe limiting in terms of how people view writers who are identified this way. Because I mean, as Charles Wright and so many others have shown, you can have Latin, you can have Italian references, you can reference high art, and still, also write an Appalachian Book of the Dead in the same collection. But I think from sort of outside looking in, I do think that there's some sort of to put a positive spin on it, a little bit of kind of mythos. So there's some sort of like aura surrounding these terms that I don't think you get when you think of if you heard the term, I'm not even sure, like a West Coast poet. To me, that doesn't mean, I don't know what that means, in a way that if someone says Southern poet, I do kind of get a little bit of an aura.
Yeah, I think that's true. I feel like, culturally, maybe Southern and Appalachian have some negative connotations too, especially in recent years. I feel like Appalachia's been blamed for a lot of stuff that maybe it's not really Appalachia's fault, but I know that as a brand, it can be. When I think of this question, I think of Elizabeth Bishop, who would never allow her poems to be published in only anthologies of female writers. And I mean, she had layered reasons for that. But one of those reasons was she didn't want to be boxed into a category. She didn't want to just be looked at as representing one facet of life. And so I feel like, her contemporary Robert Hayden was not crazy about being an African-American poet, being called an African-American poet or a Black poet. And so I feel like whatever the adjective before writer is probably going to have some positive and negative connotations, but and also, to be honest, it can have a lot of the positives can out measure the negatives, because it gives you an audience. It gives you there are a lot of readers who care about Appalachia who might not read a lot of poetry, but they might read poetry that comes from the place that they care about, or the place that they write about, or the place that they where they grew up. And I think for whatever the adjective is, that there is the benefit of possibly ushering in an audience, helping a writer find readers who might not find them otherwise.
That's a good point. And I think if you just think about a bookstore, for example, I think writers get frustrated by the fact that there are a dozen labels on the wall, right? And a lot of people don't fit neatly in those categories. That, you know, there's the young adult section and there's the fantasy section. And I think writers sometimes get frustrated by their placement. But in terms of the bookstores, it's kind of just directing readers in the right area. This is what you're interested in. And, you know, perhaps you will find it on these shelves. So yeah, there is kind of a practical reason to embrace these terms as well, I think.
Yeah.
And poet as well has I feel like as soon as you say poetry, a lot of people react. So it's not just Southern.
They're like, whoa, not that.
Yeah, not that. Anything but that.
Yeah. The adjectives and also sometimes the nouns can be. Yeah.
There's a bookstore I like in Florida. It's called Sundog Books. It's in Seaside, Florida. And it's a great little shop. I always find something, but it is at least one of my visits. Absolutely nothing was in any or recognizable order. So not alphabetized. And I think there were loosely categories, but I think they just have so many people in. By the end of the day, it's like a clothing shop. Everything's strewn about. And it is kind of fun, actually. It's more like a treasure hunt.
Yeah. There's nothing I love more than a slightly disorganized or majorly disorganized used bookstore.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's one in DC. I think it's called City Bookstore or something like that. And you really think that if you move the wrong book, the whole building's going to collapse. That there are columns to the ceiling. There's in the bathroom, there's books stacked. And so, you know, you want to take something out, but you also think, well, I don't want to be the one that takes out the Jenga piece and this whole thing just collapses.
Yeah.
Well, what do you think? Should we read a little more?
I'd love to hear another poem or another section of a poem.
Excerpt. Okay. I was going to read from the title poem. I thought that might be nice. Just a small section from Black Zodiac. And I dog-eared these pages, but I dog-eared so many, I kind of made it useless for myself.
Me too.
Yeah, let's see. Oh, yeah, I just thought I would, this is from the fourth section. So I'm just starting in the middle, which I hope is not too disorienting for everyone. But I love that he starts with this examination of the Socrates famous line, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And he says, really? So I just like the sort of confidence, and then of course where this goes. So I'm just going to read this short passage. If anyone has the book with them, page 65. The unexamined life's no different from the examined life. Unanswerable questions, small talk, unprovable theorems, long abandoned arguments. You've got to write it all down. Landscape or waterscape, light length on evergreen, dark sidebar of evening. You've got to write it down. Memory's handkerchief, death's dream and automobile, God's sleep. You've still got to write it down. Moon half empty, moon half full, night starless and egoless, night blood black and prayer black, spider at work between the hedges, last bird call, toad in a damp place, tree frog in a dry.
Yeah, I love it.
Maybe that's a better answer to the question of how to stay sharp. You write it down. You got to write it down. You have to write it down.
Yep, you've got to write it down. I love how questioning he is. And there's an earlier, maybe it's in the first poem that we read from earlier, where he quotes Ezra Pound, who was one of his real poetry mentors in terms of style and form and reference. And Pound said, "Go in fear of abstractions." And Wright quotes that. And then below he says, "Well, possibly." And then to go through all of these abstractions and how essential they are to our lives and our poetry. And, as long as you can locate them, as long as you can ground them, then the abstractions themselves may not be that much to fear. I love how he's willing to challenge the sort of, higher platitudes of, and not even platitudes exactly, but just like these statements that have had this staying power in our consciousness.
Right. It's sort of, that's not a ghost coming in. That's the dogs. That's the dogs. Hi, everyone. You can maybe see the tall one. No,
I could for a second
you
there.
did a second. Okay.
Oh, I love it. I've had to lock my cats out.
Yeah.
If I hadn't, they would have been all over. That was, they'll be scratching at the door before long too.
I'm surprised I made it 45 minutes, honestly.
Yeah.
They're usually very curious about what's going on.
Yeah, it must be time for something.
It must be time for something. But I think the way he sort of is willing to sort of consider Socrates, I think there's a Dante passage he unpacks a little bit as well, relates to one of my favorite parts of this collection, which is that these sort of direct addresses to God.
Yes.
The sort of, it's a little bit how I was joking at the beginning that he has these, he tells death, not now. He doesn't literally do that, but he does literally address God, and often in this collection, with complaints, with concerns, with questions.
Yep.
I think there is this sort of, it's laced with humor, but it's also, it feels like a serious dialogue that he really does want to know the answers to these questions that are unanswerable.
Yep. Yeah, I love that too. He talks at some point, I can't remember where I found this, but he says that the subject of his poetry is language, landscape, and the idea of God.
That's good. Mm-hmm.
And it's all in here. All that is in this book. I mean, this book maybe in some ways is the most the most perfect distillation of the three across a whole book of poems. And his religious references, you can see a kind of comprehensive religious knowledge there. And even if it's somewhat of a skeptic's perspective on it or a doubter's perspective on it, it's still so central to what he is exploring in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, a lot of the terms I had to look up when I was reading this, they almost always turned out to be kind of liturgical terms that I was not familiar with. So, I mean, the knowledge is there, and then there's also the skeptic's kind of viewpoint, which is, it's nice to see those in combination.
Yeah.
I was thinking about, why this one book won the Pulitzer. And sometimes these big prizes go to worthy writers, but not kind of their best books. And I do think when I was reading Black Zodiac, again, even though it's not my Charles Wright touchstone, I was like, yeah, this is so well deserving of the kind of highest praise and highest prize that we can bestow.
Yeah. I think so too. I think there are a few things that came together in this one that had been there all along, but maybe in some of the earlier books. I love long poems. I will read a 50-page poem and I'll stay with it if it's great. I will also abandon a 50-page poem if it's not really, really good. But I think this book has some longer poems, but nothing quite as long as that. I think a lot of the stuff that he'd been doing all along came together in this one. This would be a really good place to start with Charles Wright if you haven't read him before. If you're listening in and you're like, I've heard this name, but I haven't really read a lot, this actually would be a good book to start with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's not always true of a poet's kind of most praised work. I think that a lot of times someone reaches a point in their career where they've been overlooked, and understandably, the judges, the prize committees, they want to look back and honor this kind of life's work. But I don't think that's the case with this book. As you said, others had been nominated for the Pulitzer. This is the one that won, and it's a really extraordinary collection.
Yeah. He's also done a really nice job with bringing his poems together, like in this larger. I mean, this would be the place to start and proceed and end with the big volume. You can see the whole arc of his work.
And we got the whole arc here.
Hey, Patrick, you came right in time for the whole arc.
I'm at the end of the arc. I'm at the end of the rainbow. I popped in right at that extraordinary phrase. I was like, Speaking of extraordinary, tonight has been just that. So Erica and Jesse, thank you so much for taking us through Charles Wright's Black Zodiac and poetry at large. And thank you for tuning in, all y'all out there. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and a great poetry adventure awaits you. Thanks again.